Take warning, you better take warning. Take warning, you better do good. Let your light shine bright, let your light shine right. Respect your fellow man as you should. Take warning, you better take warning. Take warning, you better do good. Let your light shine bright, let your light shine right. Respect your fellow man as you should. The evil that men do lives after them. The evil that men do lives after them. Your evil today will blight your tomorrow. So do good today and avoid your sorrow. Take warning, you better take warning. Take warning.
All right. Hey, guess what? Good evening and welcome to AWE. That's Anansi Web Education. Anansi Web Education. Well, this photograph here, many of you who may remember this individual, you know exactly what the topic is going to be like today. So just get your glass of water, coffee, whatever it is that you're having this beautiful evening. And we are going to get into some interesting points on tonight's program of AWE. That's Anansi Web Education with President David Otter Granger. Good night to you, sir. How are you?
Thank you for having me on the program again. Good night to you and your viewers and listeners. It's always good to be on Anansi Web Education. I'm good. Thank you.
And it's always good to have you on with us. How did you spend your entire week now that we're preparing for another week?
Well, I look forward to being with your viewers on Saturday evening and to share these experiences in the hope that Guyana becomes a better place for our children and grandchildren. It's not a historical program. We're not looking back. We're looking forward. But it would be futile to plan ahead without correcting the mistakes of the past. So that's what Anansi is all about, and it's something I look forward to every week. And in fact, much of my waking hours are taken up, in determining how best we could teach the present generation and future generations about how to avoid the mistakes of the past. And when we speak about the troubles, we're talking about some grave mistakes that brought this country into narco statehood and almost brought this country into ruin until the APNUFC entered office in 2015 and brought a halt to the mismanagement. We restored local government elections and we restored security sector reform. And I think people started to feel good. They had hope and they look forward to a good life. So Anansi is all about the good life.
Absolutely. All about the good life. The people had hope. And lots of hope. Guyana was once a narco state under the PPP regime, corrupt, and they had extrajudicial killings and all manner of things. And some of the players are still around, the narco players, the money launderers, the gold smugglers, and all manner of things. But let's get straight into today as we deal with, in 2024, it marks the 25th anniversary of the accession to office of Guyana's seventh president. Sorry about that, guys. In 1999. However, a deadly campaign of violence known as the Troubles soon erupted. Several hundreds were murdered during that 12-year presidency up to 2011. Jack Dale's presidency, hundreds of people were murdered under questionable circumstances. And some of you may recall too, his presidency was also had a lot of question marks over it, apart from the murders and so forth, hundreds of murders. It was vitiated in 2001 because there was an elections petition, and it was vitiated by no other than the person who is serving there when she was a judge in the High Court. That's the current chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission. So this is what we will be dealing with, the 12 years trouble, the troubles that erupted that caused the lives of several hundred persons in a small nation in population size, a small nation as Guyana. This leads us to the first question, Mr. Granger. What role did narco-trafficking play in the outbreak of the troubles at the start of the new century?
This is a very important question, although I feel that a more important question would have been, what role did state violence have? Because the state was responsible for protecting human life, for protecting its citizens. And when the state gets involved in violence, you can see the citizens have no protection. But it is true that narco-trafficking was literally the mother of all crimes during 1990s. And it started very slowly. Naturally, it started under the PNC administration, which came to an end in 1992. But even by that time, President Desmond Hoyt had established a National Drug Law Enforcement Committee, adopted an anti-drug strategy, and started to bring legislation to, in order to curtail narco-trafficking. Unfortunately, from 1993, those initiatives were thrown out of the window, were discarded. And what we saw happening is that, the import of cocaine started to spread. And it was spreading in a way that it was impossible for the government not to know what is taking place. Airstrips were being constructed, huge volumes of cocaine were coming into the country. And there had to be some level of collaboration or complicity by the security services. And in fact, the PPP dismantled the systems and the structures which were meant to prevent cocaine from taking hold in the country. In addition to that, narco-trafficking, I don't want to misapply an economic theory called Gresham's Law. Under Gresham's Law, it says that, dirty money will eventually contaminate good money, It means that dirty money will eventually drive away good money. Because if people could, build a housing scheme or get involved in any major business by laundering dirty money, it means that legitimate operators cannot compete, will not be able to compete, and they'll go out of business. So eventually, dirty money will drive clean money out of the market, and many legitimate businesses will shut down because they cannot compete with illegitimate businesses. So narco-trafficking is very harmful, and of course it distorts the economy, and it survives by starting to bribe law enforcement officers, and eventually the criminal justice system will start to collapse. The magistrates and attorneys, can be paid tremendous amounts of money by narco traffickers, and that is likely to lead to all sorts of problems when small men go into the system, and the big men can just avoid prosecution, avoid imprisonment. In addition to that, capital will fly away. People will not come to invest because international organizations, so the United States State Department, reports every single year. There's something called the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, which the whole world can read. There's also, human rights reports, which the whole world can read. And when they see that as a result of narco trafficking in a place called Guyana, that there is money laundering, that there are extrajudicial killings, that there is import of cocaine, that people in Canada, the United States, and United Kingdom are picking up traffickers are who are moving cocaine from cocaine producing countries in South America into North America. They'll be driven away. They don't want to do business. So we're really shooting ourselves in the foot. A few people might become rich and powerful, but most people will suffer. And this is exactly what started to happen in the Troubles. That the small people in villages, young people, were the ones who suffered most. And a few people became extremely rich, and they were able to become, prosperous businessmen. But all that happened at the cost of legitimate business and the cost of human safety generally. And that is one of the reasons why so many people were killed, because the drug lords, um, you know, had no uh, compulsion about killing. And as you know, many members of the police force were corrupted, and the drug lords used serving and retired members of the police force as their personal bodyguards. Um, I think every Guyanese schoolboy would know that when a certain drug lord was arrested in Paramaribo, he was in the company of a serving police officer. And so, at least his superior in the police force would have known that he's absent without leave or that he's working with the drug lord. Then we know of instances in which the commissioner of the police force had his phone bugged by a drug lord. So it was a period of lawlessness, and it was a result of narco trafficking. So I would say that the role of narco trafficking in the outbreak of the troubles was unequaled. If there were no drug trade, narco trade in Guyana, we would not have that spate of murders that we know of the troubles. Narco trafficking was the single most important contributory factor to the killings that took place during the troubles. That's my view.
Lots of that indeed. Narco and policemen escorting drug lords, bodyguards for drug lords, money launderers, uh, folks who are part of terrorism groups, financing of terrorists around the world, all manner of things that we saw then, and we're seeing similar things now in 2024. But before we go to the next question, and which obviously, sorry, I had a follow up to your first question, but it leads into the second one here. So I'll just go straight into the second question that has to do with the police and political administration at that time. So here goes the question. How did the conduct of the police force and the political administration lead led to the outbreak of the troubles? The political administration and the police force.
Uh, the two cannot be separated, and when you see the political administration appointing as a minister of public security, a minister of home affairs, an officer who had been cashiered from the Guyana Defense Force, we know that we're heading for trouble. We know that we're heading for trouble. And the police force has an act, the Police Act, and it the act prescribes a clear division between ministerial responsibility and the professional responsibility of the commissioner. In addition to that, the commissioner should retire at a certain age, and this allows for the orderly succession, so that educated, intelligent younger officers would eventually take over. And when we see one commissioner of police being given extension, or when we see police becoming involved in what they call extracurricular activities, it is well known that these officers are most likely um, being recruited by or being put into service um, by the political administration or by rogue elements in the community. So it is something that starts to run out of control once um, the police force, which is the key law enforcement agency, if it is deprived of resources, if it is allowed to have its senior officers, being given instructions by politically appointed ministers, then we don't know where the end where where the road will lead to, because we have a situation in which these drug traffickers, supply equipment, they provide gifts to the police force as rewards, and the mere acceptance of these gifts as rewards make the police beholden to businessmen. It is a very bad sign when police have to rely on gifts, monetary and other gifts from businessmen, because they will not be able to deal with those businessmen if it is ever found that those businessmen commit offenses. I'm not suggesting that businessmen are criminals or they commit, but there must be some regulatory barrier that prevents policemen from accepting gifts, especially when it is likely that the police will find it difficult to go and arrest those businessmen for any infraction of the law. So the police force was critical. One, it became a weapon of state violence because some of its officers, especially after the establishment of the Target Special Squad. And when we spoke of the men in black, the black clothes policemen, I think most survivors of the troubles would know what the black clothes policemen meant. Usually, it signified the commission of a serious offense like a killing without investigation, searches of quarters and injury to persons, to victims, without compensation. And, as a result of that, confidence eventually drained away from the police force. The loss of confidence in the police force meant that the police were not actually able to perform their functions in a legitimate way. Nobody trusted them. I can't say nobody. Generally, the police force was distrusted because people felt if they complained about the police, they themselves would become targets. So it was a very bad period, and that's why security sector reform was important. When you see the PPP administration discarding a dozen reports for security sector reform, for police reform, you can sense there's trouble. When you see one day the leading politicians seeking assistance from the UK Metropolitan Police, from Baroness Amos, from ministers of the UK government, next day they're talking with Bernard Kerrick. Next day they're talking with persons who have difficulties with the law. When you see people at the level of ministers of the government, being denied visas or having their visas removed by United States, it cannot be for good reason. When you see the government having to convene a commission of inquiry to investigate the involvement of ministers in extrajudicial killings, it's not a good sign. It means that the police force is really not performing its functions. And sometimes you can see international movies or international events in which, you know, senior officials are arrested by the police. But that doesn't happen in Guyana. That doesn't happen in Guyana. So the police force and its cozy relationship with the political administration was not a good thing for Guyana, and it contributed to the outbreak of troubles because it meant that what was regarded as a professional organization was being given prejudicial political directions by persons who did not have the training to do so. That is why we have laws. That is why the police has a separate act. That is why the defense force has a separate act. It means that a political appointee cannot direct, the defense force or direct the police force to take action, which is professionally incorrect or unacceptable. So this goes to the heart of the problem, that the relationship between the political administration and the professional organization was such that the politicians intruded into political management, professional management, and after a while, law and order broke down. And this is what happened in the Troubles, that the distrust for the police force, and the linkage with political appointees eventually led to the undermining confidence in professionalism, and nobody cared to be professional after that. You just, listened to a minister and you did what the minister said. I remember one instance during the Troubles when a notorious narco-trafficker was arrested by the army. He gave the corporal a phone and said, "Look, speak to such and such a person." He said, "That's not my boss. My boss is Colonel so and so, and I'm not going to speak to anybody on your cell phone." So it showed you the nexus between that alleged narco-trafficker and officers, even in the police and the defense force. And that is a very dangerous thing to happen. So that is my answer to the question. And once the confidence of the public had drained away from the police force, the police had no ability to operate in certain communities. And if you look back at what is happening in certain communities during the Troubles, police couldn't enter. The police had completely lost the authority to enter. And that's one of the reasons why the defense force had to be called out, because perhaps they had greater firepower. But the police force, its reputation, has been so badly damaged by the very things that it was involved in, that nearly 24 police officers ended up being killed during the Troubles. And if you go to Ibleri now, you'll see a monument. It's the first time it has happened that so many police officers were killed. Why were the police officers targeted? Because the bandits, whoever they were, felt that the police were complicit with the criminals. And it is not only for greed, it is that they were being directed or misdirected by people in higher positions. So that is what we're looking at. We're looking at a very unfortunate nexus between politics and professions, and it didn't work out, and it is not going to. It's not working out now, and it's not going to be for the good of Guyana. And I would say that the advice that was given by the UK DFID and the dozen reports and consultancies that were provided to the government of Guyana, would have helped to restore confidence in the police force if they had been implemented. And one of the big problems we had during the Troubles, one of the big problems we're having now, is the disregard for security sector reform.
David Otto Granger, former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, talking about the Troubles during Jagdev's 12 years of presidency. Hundreds of people, hundreds of folks were murdered under questionable circumstances. We just heard about the police force taking political orders and being paid by drug lords and corrupt businessmen. Mr. Granger, when you took over the country, it was obviously in such a mess, very, very bad state, torn apart. How were you able to manage in terms of putting things back or attempting to put things back together as it pertains to the police and the security sector? Just briefly, before we get to our next question.
Well, I had a vision from the start. I was aware that the causes of the violence, the causes of the uh, disorder that we had in the country, could be traced back to the failure to of the police force and the defense force to perform their professional duties in a certain way. And when you study what happened in the Troubles, you can see that there was a huge body of advice. There were consultancies, people paid visits here, made recommendations. And when the government of Guyana, under the now deceased head of the presidential secretariat, 1 week could agree to a multi-million pounds security sector reform plan, and almost the next week you could just disregard that plan, there's a serious problem. And when I entered office, I decided to not to play by the book, but to go. Security is really a straight and narrow path, and you can't take many chances because people's lives are at stake. So you had to go back to correct policing. And once you have the police force well trained, you appoint officers on the basis not of friendship or political loyalty, but on the basis of professional competence. Um, you started to see a reduction in extrajudicial killings. You started to see an improvement in police performance. And that is what happened. We got advice and we put security sector reform on a correct path. And it started to affect security of our borders, that we set up systems so that the police stations could be more efficient. We set up systems so that that whole hinterland was divided up. It used to be one police division. So we created a division in every RDC, in every region. So whereas you had one division in the whole hinterland, we now have division number 1 in Barima Waini, division number 7 in Kuyuni Mazuruni, division number 8 in Patara Sipruni, division number 9. So the security sector reform brought order to national policing. And I have this concept because of my experience in the army, my experience in academia. This is not rocket science. Other countries are lawfully administered, are correctly administered, and they don't have the sort of problems that we have in Guyana. Here we have a situation I told you about in the 1990s, when one officer was repeatedly given extensions of service, and it caused demoralization of subordinate officers. Even now, every now and then you see respected, intelligent, retired senior officers writing critically about what is taking place in the force. They're embarrassed by what is taking place in the force. And we were on the way to correcting these problems, correcting these deficiencies by putting the police force on a correct footing, which it could be recognized in the international community. But if it doesn't happen, it means that the entire country will suffer. Um, you don't run a police force to enrich one or two people or to give one or two people extended contracts of service. You run to make the country safe. And when people feel unsafe, you have aberrations. You see cases in which the police shoot somebody in Dartmouth or shoot somebody in Hazington, and months after months, these people cannot be brought to justice. And people just don't. People have just lost confidence. And I believe that the security sector reforms that we introduced in the APNU AFC administration had turned the tide, and people started to respect the police force. Extrajudicial killings were brought to an end, and some of the police abuses were brought to an end. The corruption, the bribery, um, and the simple disregard of police instructions. When you see people attacking the police, they have no respect for the police, stoning the police, shooting police. This doesn't happen in orderly countries, and the disorders come about because of the way the police force is directed, not necessarily by police officers, but by politicians. That is where the ruination started, at the political level. But policemen are well trained, and there is a large core of well trained police officers who I think could clean up the mess if they're given the opportunity to do so.
Well said. Clean up the mess, indeed. Seeing signs of the past, not so good signs at all, with the known narco traffickers, money launderers, gold smugglers, some of whom are wanted, said to be wanted by U.S. law enforcement agencies. Not a good sign at all. But this leads us to our final question for tonight. President Granger, why were measures not implemented to maintain public security, law and order at the start of the Troubles? There were signs. We saw everything there, right there. And then the political administration ignored all those signs. Why?
Well, it's difficult where I'm sitting to explain that fully. But what certainly happened is that you can see that policy decisions were made not to accept certain reforms and not to implement certain measures which could have brought narco-trafficking to an end and state violence, because by 2000, it was clear that we were drifting into not only narco-statehood, but into disorder. And I can only assume that it was felt that the alternative policing that was adopted was meant to bring about certain outcomes. And I think people felt that narco-trafficking was profitable for some persons. I pointed out that the United States report suggested that maybe 20% of the GDP could be derived from narco-trafficking. And people in need of money at various levels, at the levels of the business community or the level of the government, might feel that that is a good way to get money. And some states have been involved in narco-trafficking. And of course, things don't work out because, the damage to the country and damage to society, the damage to, the criminal justice system could be irreparable. So I would say that the decisions not to implement the public security and security sector reforms was a deliberate one. And as a result, we all suffered. From the start, I can tell you that the National Drug Law Enforcement Committee was disbanded. This was a committee that used to be chaired personally by President Hoyt. There was a strategy that was drafted that was discarded. And repeatedly, I must admit that the PPP drafted their own National Drug Strategy Master Plan. There must have been 3 or so National Drug Strategy Master Plans. They're not implemented. And when I was in office, I had created a unit called the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. Well, once the government changed in 2020, that was thrown overboard. and it no longer exists. So many of these decisions are deliberate, and one can only construe, one can only assume that the way things are the way things people want it to be. That people are happy with a certain level of criminality. It's not about matter of being sanctimonious or being self-righteous. It is a question of having a lawful state which could protect all of our citizens. And right now, people are still being killed because of narco-trafficking. The economy is still being distorted. Um, uh, Young people are being sucked into addiction and in some cases prostitution. And you can't run a lawless state. Sooner or later, there'll be massive decay, social, political, economic decay, and cultural decay as well. And I would say that the measures were not implemented because people wanted to get rich, and people felt that one way to get rich was through narco trafficking. And the reason why the security sector reform plans were thrown out of the way because they got into the way of narco trafficking. And that is all I can assume. If people felt that they were useful, if all these visits to Barnes Amos and to the United Kingdom Metropolitan Police provided good advice, well, follow the advice. But we're not seeing evidence that that advice was followed. All the documents are there. You know, anybody can go to their archives and see a dozen reports, um, but they definitely are not being implemented. I don't know that there's actually a team that is now enforcing any serious form of security sector reform.
Certainly not a bit, and it's not a good sign indeed. Certainly not a good sign. Today we dealt with, for those of you who may have joined us late, the Guyana this year, 2024. It marks the 25th anniversary of accession to office of Guyana's seventh president in 1999. However, listen, please, guys. However, a deadly campaign of violence known as the Troubles soon erupted. Several hundred persons were murdered during that 12-year presidency up to 2011. Under his presidency, under his presidency. We'll touch on this, continue next week. But President Granger, I want to thank you so much for your time and going through the start of what will be a couple of weeks of reminding individuals about the troubles, and the fact that hundreds, not dozens, but hundreds of persons were murdered under questionable circumstances. And like you said in the introduction, the reminder is not just to open old wounds, but just to pave a way forward for a better Guyana so that these things could never again happen. That's the intention. Any closing remarks before we go, sir?
Thank you for those comments, and we will continue to examine the role of violence in Guyanese society. We will look at the causes of violence, and we will continue to use Anansi Web Education to educate the public and to help all of us to overcome or to heal the wounds that were caused and to make Guyana a better place for future generations. So I would like to say that we will continue to deal with the theme of violence to make sure that violence doesn't recur and doesn't damage the new or the young generation the way it has damaged previous generations. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much. And again, during your presidency, people felt that calmness, that peace was just about to restore. Let's keep hope alive, though. Let's keep hope alive. Please give my regards to Mistress Granger and have a blessed rest of the evening. Thank you, sir.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, thank you all so much. See you back next week. Same place, same time. God bless you.
Take warning. You better take warning. Take warning. You better do good. Let your light shine bright. Let your light shine right. Respect your fellow man as you should. Take warning. You better take warning. Take warning.